The cold wind howled through the empty road, sending dry leaves rolling across the pavement. But German Shepherd lay still near the ditch, his thin body barely moving. His fur, once thick and strong, was now dirty and tangled. His ribs showed through his skin, and his breathing was slow. He was too weak to move, too tired to fight. The dog didn't know how long he had been there. His memories were blurry: hunger, pain, and the feeling of being left behind. His legs ached, and his stomach hurt from days without food. He had once had a home, but now he had nothing. Cars rushed past him, their headlights flashing in the darkness. No one stopped. No one even looked. People were too busy, too far away in their own lives to notice a dying dog by the road. Then a loud honk made the dog's ears twitch. A large truck slowed down and pulled over to the side. The engine rumbled, and a door creaked open. Heavy boots stepped onto the pavement. Jake climbed out of his truck and rubbed his hands together. It was freezing outside. He had been driving for hours, and all he wanted was to get home. But something had caught his eye: a dark shape lying near the road. At first, he thought it was just a pile of trash. But then he saw the shape move. "A dog," Jake muttered. He frowned and took a few steps forward. The dog didn't react. He didn't lift his head or wag his tail. He just lay there, too tired to care. Jake crouched down. The dog's eyes were dull, lifeless. He looked like he had given up. Jake had seen a lot of sad things in his life, but this was different. "Hey, buddy," Jake said softly. He reached out a hand, but the dog flinched. Even in his weak state, he was afraid. Jake sighed. He wasn't sure what to do. He had places to be, miles to drive, but could he really leave the dog here, alone in the cold? He looked around. There were no houses nearby, no shelters, nothing. If he left, the dog would die. Jake made his decision. "All right, boy, let's get you out of here." He slowly took off his jacket and placed it over the dog's body. Then, gently, he lifted the weak animal into his arms. The dog was lighter than he expected, too light for a big, strong breed like a German Shepherd. Jake carried him carefully to the truck and placed him on the passenger seat. The dog barely moved, only giving a small whimper as he lay down. Jake closed the door and started the engine. The heater blasted warm air into the cabin. The dog let out a small breath, his body relaxing just a little. Jake glanced at him. "I don't know what happened to you, boy, but you're safe now." The truck pulled back onto the road, disappearing into the night. The German Shepherd, too weak to stay awake, closed his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he thought he had lost. The truck rumbled down the empty highway, its tires humming against the road. Inside, the heater blew warm air, melting away the cold that had clung to the German Shepherd's thin body. The dog lay curled on the passenger seat, too weak to lift his head. His breaths were slow but steady. Jake kept glancing at him as he drove. The poor animal looked like he had been starving for weeks. His fur was matted, his ribs stuck out, and his paws were rough and cracked. Jake sighed. He hadn't planned on rescuing a dog tonight. He was just a truck driver, always on the road, always moving. He wasn't even sure what he was supposed to do with the dog now. But he knew one thing: he couldn't leave him behind. After a while, the dog let out a small whimper. His nose twitched, sniffing the warm air inside the truck. He opened his eyes just a little, looking around. "Hey, buddy," Jake said softly. "You waking up?" The dog lifted his head slightly, but his body was too weak to do more. His brown eyes met Jake's for just a second before he looked away. He didn't trust humans, at least not yet. Jake reached for a plastic bag on the seat. He had picked up a sandwich from a gas station earlier, but he wasn't hungry anymore. Carefully, he unwrapped the bread and pulled out a few small pieces of meat. "You gotta eat, pal," he said, holding out a piece of ham. The dog sniffed the air, but didn't move. He was too tired, too unsure. Jake placed the food near him, and kept driving. For a few minutes, nothing happened. But then, slowly, the dog stretched his neck forward and licked the meat. He chewed weakly, his body shivering as he swallowed. "That's it," Jake murmured. "You're gonna be all right." The dog ate a little more, but he was still exhausted. He rested his head back down and closed his eyes again. Jake drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. The nearest town was still miles away. He needed to find a vet. Fast. An urgent stop. About an hour later, Jake spotted a glowing sign in the distance. Haven Animal Clinic. 24 hours. He pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine. The dog didn't move. Jake got out, walked around the truck, and opened the door. Carefully, he picked up the weak shepherd in his arms. "Come on, buddy. Let's get you some help." The clinic door chimed as he stepped inside. A young woman at the front desk looked up in surprise. "Oh my gosh," she gasped, rushing over. "What happened to him?" "I found him on the road," Jake said. "He's in bad shape." The woman nodded. "Follow me." She led Jake to a small examination room where a veterinarian in a white coat was already preparing. Jake gently placed the dog on the table. The vet, an older man with kind eyes, ran his hands over the dog's body, checking his ribs, his paws, his ears. "He's severely malnourished," the vet said. "Dehydrated too. If you hadn't picked him up, he wouldn't have lasted another day." Jake swallowed. He had known the dog was in bad shape, but hearing it out loud made his chest tighten. "Can you save him?" he asked. The vet gave a small smile. "We'll do everything we can." Jake nodded. He didn't know why he felt so strongly about this dog, but one thing was clear. He wasn't leaving him behind. For the first time in a long time, the German Shepherd was in safe hands. The small examination room was quiet except for the steady beeping of a machine. The German Shepherd lay on the table, his breathing shallow. The vet worked quickly, checking his heart, his eyes, and his weak limbs. "He's been through a lot," the vet said, shaking his head. "He's dangerously underweight. He hasn't had food in a long time." Jake watched, his fists clenched. The dog had been alone for who knew how long. How had no one stopped to help him before? The vet hooked the dog up to an IV drip. "He needs fluids right away," he explained. "His body is weak, but we're going to give him a fighting chance." Jake let out a slow breath. "Do you think he'll make it?" The vet hesitated. "It depends on how strong he is. He's barely holding on." Jake looked at the dog. His fur was dirty, his body thin, but there was something in him, something that refused to give up. "Come on, buddy," Jake murmured. "You're not alone anymore." The long night. The vet let Jake stay in the room while they monitored the dog. A soft blanket was placed over him, and a bowl of water sat nearby in case he woke up. The night stretched on, the clock ticking softly on the wall. Jake sat beside the table, watching the dog's slow breathing. His heart ached for the poor creature. He had never been the type to get attached, but something about this dog made it impossible to walk away. The hours passed. The dog didn't move. Jake felt his eyelids grow heavy, but every time he closed his eyes, he thought about the dog lying alone in the cold. If he had come just a little later, would the dog still be alive? He sat up straighter and rubbed his face. He had to believe the dog would pull through. A sign of life. As dawn broke, soft light spilled through the window. Jake stretched his arms, his muscles stiff from sitting all night. He looked at the dog, hoping for a change. Then something happened. The dog's ear twitched. Jake sat forward. "Hey, buddy." Slowly, the dog's eyes fluttered open. They were tired, unsure, but they were open. His nose moved slightly as he sniffed the air. Jake's chest tightened with relief. "You made it," he whispered. The vet walked in, smiling. "That's a good sign. He's responding." The dog tried to lift his head but was too weak. Instead, he let out a soft whimper. Jake reached out carefully. "You're okay now." The dog's eyes flickered to him. For the first time, there was something there. Recognition. A small spark of trust. The vet nodded. "With the right care, he'll recover. It won't be easy, but I think he has the will to live." Jake looked at the dog, then back at the vet. "What happens now?" The vet hesitated. "We can keep him here for a while, but after that, he'll need a home." Jake's heart pounded. He hadn't planned on taking in a dog. His life was on the road, always moving. He wasn't sure if he could handle it. But as he looked at the German Shepherd, something inside him knew the truth. He wasn't going to leave him behind. Not this time. The German Shepherd lay in a soft bed inside the vet clinic, his body still weak, but his eyes a little brighter. The IV drip had helped, and now he could lift his head and look around. He was safe, warm, and no longer alone. Jake stood by the door, watching him. The vet had done everything possible to help the dog, but his recovery would take time. He needed food, rest, and care. Jake let out a slow breath. He had been on the road for years, never staying in one place for long. He wasn't sure if he could take care of a dog. But as the shepherd slowly turned his head and looked at him, something inside Jake softened. The dog wasn't just looking around. He was looking for him. A difficult decision. The vet walked in with a clipboard. "Good news," he said. "He's showing signs of improvement. He'll need small meals, lots of water, and time to build his strength." Jake nodded. "So, what happens now?" The vet sighed. "We can keep him here for a little while, but he needs a home. He's been through too much to go back to a shelter." Jake looked at the dog again. He had no name, no family. He had been abandoned once before. Could Jake really let that happen again? He ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I'm the right guy for this." The vet smiled. "You already saved his life. Maybe that's a sign." Jake let those words sit in his mind. He had spent years driving from place to place, never forming attachments. But this dog had already found a way into his heart. The German Shepherd shifted in his bed, letting out a soft sigh. Jake made his decision. "I'll take him," he said. "He comes with me." The first step. A few hours later, Jake walked out of the clinic with the dog in his arms. He had signed the papers, gotten a small bag of food, and listened carefully to the vet's instructions. The dog wasn't strong enough to walk yet, so Jake carefully placed him in the passenger seat of his truck. He tucked a blanket around him and made sure he was comfortable. "All right, buddy," Jake said as he climbed into the driver's seat. "Looks like we're road partners now." The dog didn't move much, but his eyes followed Jake as he started the truck. The rumbling engine didn't scare him. In fact, he seemed calmer than before. Jake glanced at him and smiled. "We gotta think of a name for you." The dog blinked, his tired eyes filled with quiet trust. Jake tapped the steering wheel. "Max," he said suddenly. "How about Max?" The dog's ears twitched slightly. Jake chuckled. "Max it is." As the truck rolled onto the highway, the wind howled outside, but inside, it was warm and safe. Max had been abandoned, left to die. But now, for the first time in a long time, he had something he never thought he'd have again. A home. And a friend. The highway stretched for miles, endless and quiet. The truck rumbled along the road, carrying two travelers, one man and one recovering dog. Max lay curled up on the passenger seat, his body still weak, but his breathing steady. Jake kept glancing at him. It had only been a few hours since they left the vet, but something felt different. He wasn't just a truck driver anymore. He was now responsible for Max. "You comfortable over there?" Jake asked, even though he knew Max couldn't answer. Max didn't lift his head, but his ears twitched slightly. Jake took that as a good sign. A small victory. After a few hours, Jake pulled into a rest stop. He parked under a tree, turned off the engine, and stretched his arms. Then he looked over at Max. "All right, buddy. Let's see if you can stand." Jake carefully picked up Max and placed him on the ground. Max wobbled slightly but managed to stay up. His legs were thin and weak, but he wasn't giving up. "That's it," Jake said, crouching beside him. "One step at a time." Max sniffed the ground cautiously. The cold air carried new scents: trees, dirt, and the distant smell of food from a nearby diner. His nose twitched, and for the first time, his tail gave a small, uncertain wag. Jake smiled. "You like that, huh?" Max took one slow step forward, then another. His body was weak, but his spirit was still strong. Jake opened a small container of food from the vet and placed it on the ground. Max hesitated at first, then sniffed the food and started eating. Watching him eat, Jake felt a sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A moment of fear. After their break, Jake lifted Max back into the truck. He adjusted the blanket around him and got back behind the wheel. As they drove, the sun started to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The warmth of the truck and the steady motion of the road made Max relax. But then, as they passed a stretch of empty land, something changed. Max's ears flattened and his body tensed. His breathing grew fast, and his eyes darted around, full of fear. Jake noticed immediately. "Hey, what's wrong?" Max let out a low, shaky whimper. He wasn't looking at Jake. He was looking outside, at the darkening road. Jake's chest tightened. Was this where he had been abandoned? Had Max been dumped somewhere like this? Jake slowed the truck slightly. "It's okay, buddy. You're not there anymore." Max didn't understand the words, but he heard Jake's calm voice. His breathing slowed, just a little. Jake reached out, gently resting his hand on Max's back. "You're safe now." Max hesitated, then slowly laid his head on Jake's leg. Jake froze. For the first time, Max had come to him for comfort. A small moment, but a big step. A new beginning. As the truck kept moving, Max kept his head resting beside Jake. His body was still weak, and his heart still carried fear, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something new. Trust. And with trust came something even more powerful: hope. Jake smiled as he kept driving. "We're gonna be all right, Max." And deep down, for the first time in years, he believed it. The road stretched on, mile after mile, but this time, Jake didn't feel alone. Every now and then, he glanced at Max, who was curled up on the passenger seat. The dog was still weak, but there was something different about him now. His breathing was calmer. His body was more relaxed. He was starting to feel safe. Jake smiled to himself and kept driving. A new routine. For the next few days, Jake and Max fell into a quiet rhythm. Every morning, Jake would stop at a quiet spot, lift Max out of the truck, and let him stretch his legs. At first, Max could only take a few steps before getting tired. But with each passing day, he grew a little stronger. His legs became steadier, and his eyes looked brighter. Jake made sure Max ate small meals throughout the day, just as the vet had instructed. The first few times, Max was hesitant. He would sniff the food, then look at Jake, as if unsure whether it was really his. "It's yours, buddy," Jake would say softly. "No one's gonna take it from you." Slowly, Max started to trust that the food would always be there, that Jake would always be there. A moment of joy. One afternoon, Jake pulled into a rest stop near a grassy field. It was quiet, with only a few parked cars in the distance. The air smelled fresh and the sun was warm. Jake stepped out and lifted Max onto the grass. The dog stretched his legs and sniffed the ground, his tail giving a small, curious wag. Jake smiled. "Feels good, huh?" Then something happened, something Jake hadn't expected. Max took a step forward, then another. Then, with a burst of energy, he trotted a few feet ahead. Jake's heart pounded with excitement. He had never seen Max move like this before. The dog was still thin, still recovering, but for the first time, He wasn't just walking, he was exploring. And then something even more incredible happened. Max turned back to Jake, his ears perked up. His tail wagged, really wagged, for the first time. Jake let out a soft laugh. "Well, look at you." Max took a few more steps, then stopped and looked back again, as if waiting for Jake. Jake crouched down and held out his hand. "Come here, buddy." Max hesitated for only a second before walking straight to him. Jake rubbed the dog's head, feeling warmth rush through him. It was just a small moment, but it meant everything. Max wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. The bond grows. That night, as they settled into the truck for another long drive, Max curled up on the seat beside Jake. But this time, instead of lying stiffly, he did something different. He pressed his nose against Jake's arm and let out a soft sigh. Jake felt his throat tighten. He reached down and ran a hand through Max's fur. "You're a tough one, you know that," he murmured. Max didn't move, but his breathing was steady. He was calm. He trusted Jake now, and for the first time, Jake realized something too. He needed Max just as much as Max needed him. As the truck rumbled down the road, man and dog, side by side, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt home. The road stretched ahead, endless as always, but Jake no longer felt alone. Max was by his side, his body stronger than before, his eyes brighter. He was still thin, still recovering, but each day he showed more life. Jake had started talking to Max more often. "You ever see the mountains, buddy?" he asked one afternoon as they drove past a towering range. Max's ears twitched, his head tilting slightly as if he was listening. Jake chuckled. "Maybe we'll stop and let you run around one of these days." Max wagged his tail, a small but real movement. It made Jake's heart swell. A new challenge. That evening, Jake pulled into a quiet rest stop near a lake. The air was crisp, the sky painted with deep oranges and purples. It was a peaceful place, perfect for a break. Jake opened the truck door and helped Max onto the ground. The German Shepherd stretched his legs and sniffed the air. "Come on, let's take a little walk," Jake said. Max followed, still moving slowly but with more confidence now. They walked along the water's edge, the soft breeze ruffling Max's fur. Then Jake stopped and pulled something from his pocket, a small, worn-out tennis ball. He held it up. "Ever play fetch before?" Max stared at the ball, his ears perking up slightly. Jake gave it a gentle toss a few feet ahead. The ball rolled on the grass, stopping near a tree. Max hesitated. He looked at Jake, then at the ball. Jake crouched down. "It's okay, buddy. Go get it." For a moment, Max didn't move. Then, slowly, he took a step toward the ball. Another step. He reached it and sniffed it carefully. Then, to Jake's surprise, Max picked it up. Jake grinned. "That's it, boy. Bring it here." Max turned, the ball in his mouth. He took a few steps toward Jake before dropping it on the ground. Jake laughed. Close enough. It was just a simple game, a small thing. But for Max, it was everything. It was proof that he could trust again, that he could play again. Facing the past. As they walked back to the truck, Jake noticed something. Max wasn't just following him anymore. He was walking beside him. Not out of fear, not because he had to, because he wanted to. Jake reached down and gave Max a gentle pat. "You're doing good, buddy." Max looked up at him, his tail wagging again. Then, as they reached the truck, something happened. A loud noise echoed in the distance, an old car backfiring. Max froze. His body went stiff, his ears pinned back. His breathing became quick, panicked. Jake's heart clenched. It was fear, the kind of fear that came from bad memories. Jake crouched down beside him. Hey, it's okay," he said softly. "You're safe." Max's eyes darted around, his muscles tense. Jake didn't rush him. He just stayed there, his hand resting lightly on Max's back. "I'm right here, buddy." Slowly, Max's breathing slowed. His body relaxed. After a moment, he stepped forward. Just a small step, but it was enough. Jake let out a slow breath. "That's it. You're okay." Max leaned into him slightly, pressing his head against Jake's arm. It wasn't easy. The past still haunted Max. But he wasn't facing it alone anymore. He had Jake, and Jake had him. As they climbed into the truck and drove off, Jake knew one thing for sure. Max wasn't just some dog he had saved. Max was family. The road had been long, filled with challenges and small victories. But now, as Jake drove down a quiet stretch of highway, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a journey anymore. It was home. Max lay in the passenger seat, his body stronger than ever. His fur had regained its shine, his eyes were full of life, and his tail wagged more often now. He no longer looked like the weak, abandoned dog Jake had found. He was happy. Jake glanced at him. "You know, buddy, I never planned on having a dog." Max turned his head slightly, as if he understood. Jake chuckled. Guess life had other plans. A special stop. That afternoon, Jake pulled off the highway and onto a small, quiet road. The air smelled fresh, and the sight of green fields stretched far and wide. Max sat up, ears perked with curiosity. Jake smiled. "Wait till you see this." A few minutes later, they arrived at a little house with a big open yard. It wasn't fancy, just a cozy place with a wooden fence and a small porch. But to Jake, it felt right. He parked the truck and looked at Max. "What do you think?" Max's tail wagged, slow at first, then faster. Jake opened the door, and for the first time, Max jumped out on his own. No hesitation, no fear, just excitement. He sniffed the ground, then trotted across the yard, his legs steady and strong. Jake watched him, feeling something tighten in his chest. Max wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. The final test. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out the same tennis ball he had used before. He held it up. "All right, Max. Let's see what you got." He threw the ball across the yard. For a second, Max hesitated. Then, with a burst of energy, he ran. Really ran. His paws kicked up the dirt, his tail wagging wildly. He reached the ball, grabbed it, and turned back toward Jake, running even faster. Jake laughed. "That's my boy." Max reached him and dropped the ball at his feet. Jake knelt down, rubbing Max's fur. "You did good, buddy." Max licked Jake's hand, his eyes shining with trust, love, and something even stronger, belonging. A new beginning. That night, Jake sat on the porch, watching the stars. Max lay beside him, his head resting on Jake's boot. Jake let out a deep breath. For years, he had traveled, never staying in one place, never letting himself get attached. But now, everything felt different. He wasn't alone anymore. He reached down and patted Max's head. "Welcome home, buddy." Max sighed in contentment, his body fully relaxed. He had been abandoned, left to die. But because of one stranger's kindness, he had found something he never thought he would again. Love, a home, a family, and he would never be alone again.